All right, it's 10:02, so I'm going to get started. Good morning. Welcome for those who maybe I don't know. My name is Shana V. White from the Kapor Center. Diane Levitt asked me a long time ago to speak at this event. I'm actually on PTO today, so I'm glad to be here just because I love sharing the resources that we've created at the Kapor Center. But as you probably noticed, I'm drinking a smoothie, and you see my son's Dragon Ball Z stuff in the background. I didn't really necessarily like get all formal for this presentation because I'm on PTO. I'm actually headed on a flight in about 3 hours. But I'm glad to be here and want this to be just kind of a space where you can ask as many questions as you have, and definitely put anything you have in the chat, like stop me if something is confusing or anything that you want to just talk about. Because when I first agreed to do this, I didn't know it was going to be a whole hour, and I hate talking to people for a whole hour. But I think that Tom told me that like I can't invite people on stage, which I don't agree with that. But if you want to ask me questions, like I am more than happy to mute myself and let y'all talk, because I'd rather it be more interactive than just me sitting here talking to y'all straight for like 55 minutes. All right, as I mentioned before, I work at the Kapor Center, which is based out in Oakland, California. Luckily, I get to work remote from Atlanta, where I grew up as a kid. My official title is the Director of CS Equity at the Kapor Center. I work under the leadership of Dr. Allison Scott, who is the CEO of the Kapor Foundation. We're a philanthropic organization that likes to support lots of different things in computer science equity. We also do some work in tech workforce as well as tech policy as well. But the arm that I'm focused on and the arm that I'm in charge of is the arm that focuses directly on K-12 CS equity. So this is our kind of like thought process behind moving things and moving the needle in K-12. We do know that this higher ed component is a component as well, but I personally, as a former classroom teacher, just believe it's a melee, especially in K-8 with computer science, because everybody's being fed lots of information, and there has not been like a clear, direct path as far as this is how it's going to set kids up not only for success in just being good digital citizens, good computer scientists, good computational thinkers, but also just introducing them to the breadth of and the depth of computer science. And so we think focusing our efforts on K-12, like I said, higher ed is an important factor in that, but we're really kind of trying to hone in on K-12 to kind of enact this kind of vision to say, okay, we understand computer science is important. We understand we want to create students that can critically think and can problem solve, which computer science can help them do. But ultimately, we also want to always center racial justice and racial equity in all the work that we do. And all the other forms of equity. We have gender equity, equity for students that have disabilities, our emerging English language learners, all those different identity markers that our students bring into buildings. We want to leverage that, to use that as an asset rather than a deficit-based mindset to say, hey, computer science might not be something that you're interested in, but it will help you in the future with whatever you decide to do. So we have 3 different arms within our K-12 computer science education aspect. We do research. You'll see some data for some research about teachers, which is why we created some of these tools that I'll go over today. We also do state policy advocacy. We're really big in California just because our headquarters are there, but we're also involved with policy in Georgia now that I'm on the staff and have contacts and connects in Georgia. And then we support other states as well. And then the last one is the implementation of the framework. We released the culture responsive framework in June of 2021. And we basically kind of wanted to set a North Star for computer science education. The scholarship for culture responsive, culturally relevant, and culture sustaining like pedagogy have been around for 30 plus years. But no one has explicitly, besides New York, literally said, well, let's talk about this as it relates to computer science. And so using the framework that New York DOE, Christy Crawford, and those great people put together a while back, and then a lot of their scholarship, we put together a framework that was explicitly saying, this is what it means to be culture relevant and responsive in your computer science classrooms. So a part of that framework is releasing instructional resources, which I'll talk about today. We also have offered and will continue to offer professional development. And then we partner with key districts. We work directly with Oakland Unified School District out in California. And then I work directly with a couple school districts here in Georgia, where I actually do coaching for the teachers. We help them with curriculum. We help them with anything they need, field trips, those types of things, ultimately to give better outcomes for students that are Black, Native, and Latinx. Our schools that we work with are predominantly, so over 65% student population is either Black, Latinx, or Native. So we're very explicit in working with schools that usually tend to be underfunded, tend to not be considered schools where there are students that are interested in pursuing computer science careers, and we're trying to help them create pathways so that all students can be successful or have the opportunity to be successful in computer science. So this is some of the research that we've done, and this one is very important because we need to know what the teachers who are teaching students, like their demographics, but also understand what their knowledge base is. I think the big thing that I learned even as a computer science teacher is a lot of computer science teachers are thrown into computer science from either business, from math. I've seen science as well. And so there's this big kind of like crossroads where it's like, we want teachers to be comfortable with CS context because it is complex, but at the same token, we don't want to literally like undermine their ability to teach. Because everybody innately who is in education, if you went through, pre-service programs, all these types of things, have been giving the tools to be able to teach or educate young people. And so it's one of those things where it's like CS brings on this whole thing of just rigor with content, and it kind of scares people away. And so we wanted to just kind of understand where computer science teachers were as like a baseline of understanding just basic things, which helps us help them create tools to help them be successful in teaching diverse student groups, to teach inclusively, to make sure that their materials are accessible so that all kids can experience success. A lot of times we hear a lot of the data that sits there and says like 51% of high schools now offer CS, but then we don't look past that number to say like, well, how many students are actually taking it? And then that's when we dig in and we see, well, it's actually not that many students taking it. And especially we see that with girls. We see that with non-binary kids. We see that with Black students. We see that with Latinx students. And we see that with our Native students. So we can say and tout with our reports. I know code.org always releases that, oh, we have 51% of students or 51% of schools offer computer science. And then I always ask how many students are actually taking computer science. And then there's a lot of quiet because that number is significantly lower. So just a little bit of demographics of CS teachers, which are very similar to the teaching profession in general. 73% of teachers are white, 53% are female, and then 50% are early career teachers. And that means early career is within their first 5 years of teaching. So that's a large percentage of teachers that are literally just getting out of teacher pre-service programs and being put into computer science classrooms, which we all know for those of us who are teachers on this call, it takes your first 5 years to really figure out what you're doing and to be successful with students moving forward. 65% of teachers were confident using culturally relevant pedagogy to support student learning. So that number, you might say, oh, 65, that's pretty good. But we have to understand most public schools in the United States are predominantly be 5%. So even though that number is over 50, it's still not enough to make sure that we're doing all that we can as teachers to make sure that we reach the diversity of the students that we're serving. 69% of teachers saw the importance of covering computing's role in perpetuating biases, racism, sexism, other inequities, and only 50% teach on topics related to ethics and social impacts of technology. We have to let our students know, and I think a lot of times teachers are not aware how impactful technology is to society, and that a lot of the inequities that exist, technology is just exacerbating them. So you think about things like AI, and that's like the new buzz, and oh, everybody's talking about AI. All the racism and the white supremacy that exists in our country and in our world, AI is just picking up on that and just continuing to magnify it. So helping our students understand that they have to be critical consumers of the technology that they're using. And then also we want to create not more tech bros, but people that are actually thinking about being responsible with the technology they're producing, that I'm going to produce tools, apps, whatever the case may be, that are inclusive, that are accessible, that are not going to exacerbate any type of inequity or any type of societal harm to a marginalized group. And then 71%, and this was the really promising part of this data, is that teachers want to develop their skills on being equitable computer science teachers. They want to do these types of things, but a lot of times, as I mentioned before, we have most of our PD providers, they're focused mostly on the content of CS. And I feel like you're supposed to do the other part first. The content will come. That was always my philosophy as a classroom teacher, because I was self-taught with computer science, is that I want to make sure my class is inclusive and equitable and every kid feels like they're a part of this classroom community before I worry about teaching them an algorithm or teaching them binary or teaching them anything else. All right. So based on that data, I met with Dr. Scott, my boss, and our research team, and I said, okay, so now that we know where the teachers stand, what are the things that we can do to leverage resources that we have at the Kapor Center to help kind of make those numbers a lot better, which are going to also create better outcomes for marginalized student groups. So the first two things that we created, because I know that teachers have to sometimes have to take box curriculum. Districts buy it, they pay a lot of money for it, and so they force teachers to use it. So some teachers don't have the autonomy to create their own lessons. They have to use what they're given. So the first thing that I wanted to do, even though Christy is always like ringing in my head whenever I'm thinking about creating things, is that you really can't boil this down to a checklist as far as thinking, I can be culture responsive if I check off these 4 boxes. But ultimately, we wanted to give teachers an opportunity to do a quick check of their box curriculum so they can see the gaps that exist in their curriculum that is aligned with our framework. So does this lesson talk about like inclusivity, accessibility? Does this lesson give students a chance to show agency? Does this lesson think of family and community as assets? Does it bring in diverse perspectives in the sense of diverse speakers as it relates to this content area? Does this lesson give you the opportunity to talk about some negative ism and how technology is impacting or how technology has impacted this thing? So the lesson materials worksheet and all these resources are free on our website, and I'll show you a little bit later where you can get them. Basically is to help teachers that have to do box curriculum to do a quick check so they can see the gaps in the curriculum that they're having to use, so they know, I want to be a culture responsive teacher. I want to make sure that my classroom is inclusive and it's equitable. So I'm going to have to fill in these gaps with extra materials or extra information to cover the things that the box curriculum is not. The other thing that we created, just because as a teacher, a lot of times, like I said, most teachers have to use box curriculum. I was lucky in many of my years of teaching that I had a principal that was super supportive. I always shout him out. His name is Jay Niebel. He always let me have time to plan stuff because he saw the outcomes were always good with students. But I feel like curriculum providers are not doing a heavy enough lift to help teachers. I think they've gotten off and they're making tons of money off of our schools, and they're not doing the lifting that they need to help teachers be more culturally responsive and gathering all the information and the resources for them. It's just not enough to have dogs jumping across the screen or monsters jumping across the screen. How are you sitting there and letting kids maybe make their own avatars that look like them? How are you exposing them to topics that are talking about some of the negative isms in our society that impact them in their communities? How are you doing that within your curriculum? Because you can, the standards allow it, but a lot of times people don't want to make that extra effort to do so. So we wanted to make something for curriculum providers to self-assess themselves against our culture responsive and sustaining framework, to sit there and say, when I'm making a lesson for whatever platform, Code HS, Tinker, all these platforms that are out there for people to use, what am I thinking about in this process, and how am I helping this teacher make this lesson culturally responsive and relevant? How am I sitting there and helping this teacher bring in diverse perspectives and ideas? How am I helping this teacher let students have agency in the classroom and also do peer teaching? All those types of things should be in lessons. It shouldn't be kids sitting in front of a screen like y'all are having to do right now, listening to my monotonous voice, but sitting in front of a screen, literally watching a video, doing an exercise, and then checking it off, and I'm done with that unit. That shouldn't be what our units are. Granted, there are topics in computer science that are very easy, they're quick, like binary, those types of things. But then how are you taking the next step as a curriculum provider to maybe sit there and say, okay, well, computers respond only to zeros and ones, and explaining binary, but then taking that next step to say, okay, so what identities are binary, and helping kids understand. That's what I'd always do with my binary unit, to help them understand that gender was not a binary. It's not boy or girl, it's a spectrum. And so what are curriculum providers doing to offer those things within their curriculum that they're creating to help teachers talk about these topics and make their classrooms inclusive and the learning environments inclusive of all students? The second thing that I am a big fan of is instructional strategies. I know as a teacher myself, I always loved to do the same instructional strategies when I was early in my career because I was comfortable with them. And I was like, you know what, this is, I'm doing this because I'm comfortable. What is best for my students? And so I did some research to find out other instructional strategies that are beneficial to teachers. And so when I got to the Kapor Center, I was like, that was helpful for me, but a lot of teachers don't have the time to look those things up. So they stick with their good 4 or 5 that work for them. If it's like an exit ticket, if it's like close reading, all those types of things. But what if they had a place where they could go and look up all the instructional strategies that exist, find out why they work, what the pros and cons are, also understand how they're culturally relevant, responsive, how they're going to work with students with disabilities, how does it work with students that are emerging English language learners, so that they can literally build their toolkit as a teacher. So we are excited for CS Ed Week this year to finally launch this database. There'll be 39 instructional strategies free of charge for all teachers to look up. You can look them up by keyword. You can look them up by skill that they develop. You can look them up by grade. You can look them up by content. So it's not just for CS, it's for any subject area. And that's the other thing that I'm really big on with the tools that we create, is that technically people could take the word computer science out of our tools and put their subject area in them, and it would still be applicable. So basically we'll have these databases available to all teachers during CS Ed Week. They're finalizing finally the web development for it in the next month. But basically telling teachers, these are some other strategies that you might want to implement in your classroom that might be beneficial to students, that might work with maybe your emerging English language learners that maybe you're struggling to reach as far as teaching the content, or maybe for your students with disabilities, how can you scaffold and differentiate so that you can make sure that they are still learning and experiencing success in your classroom. So we have some one-pagers on our website right now, which is basically showing you what those instructional strategies will do. Eventually it'll be in an entire database, so you can search and see all of those one-pagers individually and figure out how much time does this instructional strategy take, what tools do I need, what prep do I need to have, all those things that a teacher would need to know, so that there's the variety in instructional strategies that teachers are able to use in their classroom with their students. And then the last thing that was released, and this was all last CS Ed Week, was lesson samples. A lot of times people ask me, how did you do your lessons? And like I said, luckily I had a really great principal that gave me time to create these lessons. I know all teachers don't, but I wanted to show teachers that there's a way to take maybe certain socio-political contexts, things that are going on in the world, and still tie it to either computational thinking, to tie it to other content-based standards, to just tie in CS to anything that you're doing. Now, I understand that CS cannot be tied into every single thing, and I'm never going to say that it can. There's sometimes there's no place for CS for certain things, but ultimately I do want people to realize that it is an easy lift to bring in computational thinking in CS to any type of lesson. So I created, and with the help of a couple of other external partners, some lesson samples so that people can see these are lessons that people can use in the classroom that are science, based on standards, but basically take that critical lens for students to sit there and think about things and bring in maybe current sociopolitical context, maybe bring in something with their community, anything along those lines. So the first lesson with propaganda then and now, I actually did in my classroom. Unfortunately, I was in the classroom when the president prior to Biden was elected. I don't like to mention his name, but when he was elected, and the kids in my 8th grade class, it was really cool. I worked with their ELA teacher. They were reading the Diary of Anne Frank, and in social studies class, they were studying World War II. And I was like, oh, this is perfect. I'll just combine those and we'll talk about propaganda, misinformation, disinformation. So basically, we compared propaganda from World War II and the racist tropes that were used and had the kids literally internalize and interrogate how much had propaganda changed. Are we still using racist tropes? And the kids were like, oh my God, this is literally the exact same thing. It's just in digital form. And I said, exactly. So they're seeing that basically not only is history cyclical, but ultimately some of the tactics that are used in social media, they were around when they were on posters. It's just now digitized. So the propaganda lab allowed students to kind of compare and contrast World War II propaganda and then compare the 2016 election. How social media was used, Facebook, all these types of things to basically interfere with our elections. And so it was a really good thing where we're bringing in a current sociopolitical context, and kids are also doing stuff that's related to their standards in both their ELA class and in their social studies class. The drinking water everywhere is another lesson I created, and I took standards from the science, national science standards. In 5th grade, they're supposed to study reservoirs. And so again, I want to show teachers that you can take a lesson that's supposed to cover this and you can continue to build upon it so that it's bringing in either some type of culturally relevant, culturally responsive, or some type of sociopolitical context. So we start with reservoirs. Kids during this lesson will also do flow charting, which is a computational skill and a computer science skill on how reservoirs work. And then we take the next step where they talk about the Dakota Access Pipeline and what is environmental racism so that they understand, yeah, I'm supposed to learn about reservoirs, but there's so many layers to that. And so these are what these lessons do, is just try to show teachers that there's a way to build upon lessons that, yeah, you're still covering standards, but you're taking it to the next step. All of these lessons have the things that teachers need. So the materials that you need, the essential questions, the standards that it covers. It has enrichment opportunities. It has remediation opportunities as well. So these 4 lessons, and we have others sitting in my Google Drive that we're going to hopefully push out during CS Ed Week, are available. And the last one is I'm really excited about is we had students in Chicago. I work with Dr. Sapir Vakil. He has a program where he works with Chicago youth. They created their own lessons. So I basically helped them with the teacher side as far as what is going to be your summative assessment for this? What is your essential question? What standards you're going to cover? And they created lessons based on things that they liked. So we had stuff about NFTs. This one that we have on our website is about computers and video games and how they impact teens. So there are lots of different ways that you can really create a lesson that's going to literally elevate student voice, elevate kind of sociopolitical critiques, all those types of things, and still cover content-based and standards-based information. So this is the website that all of those things that I just mentioned can be found. So it's just kapor.org, equitable CS. And as I mentioned before, on the left are our instructional and pedagogical tools. I'm going to show you 2 new ones that we just released during CSTA this summer. These are the instructional strategy 1-pagers that I mentioned in the middle. And then on the left are the actual sample lessons that are good to go for those. And like I said, a lot of times when you'll see the next section basically goes through the process of how I went through to create these lessons so that teachers can see this is how I take a lesson that is maybe just vanilla and make it kind of like mint chocolate chip and lots of other different flavors, moving it along so that I can make sure I take that lesson and build upon it to make it really, really robust and something that students are going to engage in and enjoy. So this is the lesson materials worksheet, and it's just a screenshot of it. This is the one that I mentioned to you before, that basically if a teacher has to use box curriculum, we've created for them an interactive PDF where they can sit there and take our core components that are on the far left. And then literally I give in that middle section, does the lesson include one example of racial inequity, racism, racial justice, those types of things? And then they can check no, yes, I'm not unsure, and then make their notes there. So this helps teachers when they're using box curriculum, see what gaps exist in the box curriculum. They can do it for lessons or units, whichever they prefer. But this is just a tool that I wanted to give teachers that are required to use box curriculum, that don't want to necessarily do the extreme heavy lifting of sitting there and be like, I have to go through every lesson and like adjust these. This at least gives me a heads up that I'm going to have to do this in this lesson and this in this unit, et cetera, et cetera. The next one is just a screenshot of the curriculum developer tool. And like I said, this is just basically making curriculum developers hopefully more accountable to helping teachers, because they're making a lot of money off of our schools, but a lot of them are not doing a heavy lifting as far as helping teachers with what they actually need. There's so many times I'm on groups, Facebook groups, those types of things, and teachers are like, this curriculum, I'm missing something, I need this, I need that. And so we're hoping this, as well as some other tools coming out down the road, will make curriculum providers a little bit more accountable, so that they are helping teachers, so the teachers are not scrambling to try to find everything that they need. It's basically a way to hold curriculum providers a little bit more accountable, so they can help computer science teachers be more effective teaching in the classroom. And then this is a picture of the one pager. So as I mentioned before, it tells you the grades and the subjects. It gives you the description of the instructional strategy. It tells you when to use it, tells you the pros and cons, tells you the culturally responsive application. It tells you how long it takes in the class. It tells you what skills it builds. So if it's comprehension, vocabulary, collaboration, and then it also tells you the Bloom's level. So this will be a database with all 39 of those strategies with that access. But right now we just have the one pagers up until the database is complete. And then this is the two new tools that we created and released in July. This one is the unit planning guide. So a lot of times, as I mentioned before, people would ask me, well, how do you come up with these ideas to teach? And a lot of times it was hard to explain because my brain works a little bit differently than a lot of people's. But I said, basically, I do the standard teacher prep of my lesson, and then I take the next step and think of other things. So what we did is we put that on paper, and I'll show you on the slide towards the end some of the great people that helped me create this thing. Part one is all the things that a normal teacher is going to think about when they're doing a lesson. What standards am I going to cover? What are the essential questions? What resources do I need? What's my summative or formative assessment for this unit? All those things that a teacher thinks about when they're creating lessons. This part one is going to look very, very familiar. So I wanted to put this in kind of a PDF format so that teachers can see I can do both of these things at the same time and really make these robust, inclusive, culturally relevant, or responsive lessons. Part two is the part that's different. A lot of teachers will be like, oh, now I understand. So after I've done part one, where I figured out the standards, how long this is going to take, what my essential questions are, now can I sit there and think about how can I bring in maybe racial justice to this lesson? Can I bring in gender justice? Can I bring in disability or ableism into this lesson? Can I bring in a current or historical socio-political event? Can I bring in something that's going on in my community? So maybe there's something that's going on. I know in New York, y'all's mayor just did a heart with a robot police thing, which is so ridiculous, but that's something that's happening in your community. Just basically robots being used to terrorize marginalized communities. I know that y'all did just pass that y'all are banning facial recognition in technology in schools, which is brilliant. I retweeted that yesterday. I was really excited. Y'all are the first state in the country to ban that out of schools. So that's amazing. But maybe there's something with, the robot dogs that are in New York that I've seen all the time with Mayor Adams. Maybe you want to talk about how is technology impacting, so surveillance, those types of things. So basically it gives teachers another kind of step in their process of unit planning to think about things where they're bringing in current context, identity issues, those types of things into their classroom so that they can sit there and check themselves to say, okay, well, this might not be the unit to do racial justice, but maybe I can really talk about disability and gender justice in this unit because I see the like intersects here, here, and here. So this is, like I said, available on our website, and it just helps teachers with the process of not only just building a unit conventionally like we always used to do, but taking that next step to how can I sit there and integrate some of the issues that are going on in society's current sociopolitical context into my lesson as well. Then the other thing that we created that we released in July was a self-assessment rubric. I know teachers love rubrics. I never was a fan of rubrics, but I get their value. I just never liked them. But we wanted to make a rubric for teachers to be able to either self-assess, because a lot of times teachers are like on an island by themselves in their schools. There's nobody else that's doing CS in their school. Or if they have a peer that's maybe in another content area or an administrator that they trust, to have a way that they can be assessed as a teacher for their pedagogy and their instruction in a culture responsive, sustaining way. So this is just a really quick rubric that allows somebody to be scored based on their ability to implement the framework within their teaching. So somebody would come observe you in class, or you can, like I said, do it as a self-assessment. You go through and score yourself and then give yourself feedback based on, again, trying to give teachers as many tools as possible to make sure that they are being culturally responsive and sustaining in their classroom practices. And so here are my Equitable Toolkit Advisory Board members. Some of these names will look very, very familiar. These people have helped me for the past 2 years with a lot of these tools, and really, really grateful to all of them for their support and help in making kind of these tools that were in my brain come to life. And so that's the end of my presentation. I'm like really early, I know, but I don't want to waste y'all's time and y'all have to listen to me for longer. But I'd love to take any questions you might have or any comments, suggestions, anything would be great. I promise if you have a question, I'll be more than happy to answer. Oh, awesome. Great question, Sarah. So some of the teachers that I partner with here in Georgia, I coach them with those resources to use. What we do plan on doing is launching a cohort. I was going to launch it with Christy in September, but of course, September has flown by. Christy has her EECS program that she does. And so she wanted some of those teachers to work with me in using these tools in their classroom this year. We still might do that, but it might be in the spring instead. But right now we're thinking of, and like I said, I have to get, of course, approval from Allison, but Allison usually lets me do whatever because she knows that I know what's best for K-12, is basically create a cohort that teachers can virtually meet with me, like for coaching, to use these tools in the classroom. And then we, of course, at Kapor would pay them and then use that feedback to refine these tools and make them a little bit better. Hopefully that answers your question, Sarah. Yeah, one was one of Christy's teachers came up with one that was like e-textiles based. And then one of them was a lesson that I had teachers remix. I did native bead looming, which is central to certain native tribes. And what kids did is they could do it either digitally or analog, basically make their own bead pattern to celebrate courage, strength, resilience, those types of things, and tell a story with their bead pattern. But then understanding for us, we're Muskogee Creek land, that Muskogee Creek don't use bead looming in that way, but like Sioux people and other tribes do. So that was one that I saw a teacher remix because the tribes that were local to her state did use bead looming for storytelling. And that teacher also brought in a native person to speak to kids about the process of bead looming, and that kind of stuff. And then the kids actually, Snap lets you do the bead looming that way. So she actually used Snap to let them make the bead patterns there rather than doing it analog. I did it in my class, but the kids got to do it with paper and colored pencils. Yes. So if you go to this website that's right here on the screen, kapor.org, equitable CS, you'll see all the tools there. You just scroll down a little bit. You'll see like our framework is at the top. And then if you scroll down a little bit below, it'll show you all those tools that I mentioned to you before. I think it's on this slide here. Yeah, if you go here and you scroll down, you'll see all the resources there. Yeah, Sarah, that was the cool thing. And then also like a lot of the kids were so shocked because I was telling them about fourfold symmetry because everybody gives credit to Descartes for creating, the Cartesian coordinates or whatever. And Native people have been doing fourfold symmetry since they've existed. And so the kids were like, oh my gosh, like, I was like, this has been around. This is how they decide like religious things, how they decide like how they set up like housing, those types of things is based on fourfold symmetry. And so the kids were like so impressed and they're like, oh, good. So I can tell like my math teacher that Descartes ain't all that. I was like, well, I mean, I wouldn't say all that about Descartes to your math teacher because your math teacher might get mad, but just know that there were people doing this way before Descartes. Tom, is there a push for Kapor to integrate? That's a great question. I'm gonna refrain from answering the first one just because some of the popular curricular I'm not very fond of, to say it in a nice way. But we do want to work with teacher prep programs. We do work with them in Georgia. We have partnership with Kennesaw State, Georgia State, Clark Atlanta right now, as far as their teacher programs where we're giving them grant money to integrate CS. And so they're going to use some of these tools with their pre-service teachers. We did apply for, unfortunately, a NSF grant, but they didn't give it to us because they said it was too big. But we wanted to do an NSF grant. Sarah was going to be on the grant to basically do our culture responsive framework with higher ed, so that those professors in their like intro to STEM class were going to be teaching in a culture responsive way, but also teaching their students how to, so the teachers would get to experience it as a student, but then also understand the practices moving forward when they went into the classroom. So ideally, yes, I would love to get into teacher preparation programs a little bit more. I think like I said, my focus has always been on K-12, and it's not to say that I'm like anti-higher ed, but I think that that's a whole different beast. And K-12, we have more than enough problems to solve right now as it is. So I'm trying to get to as many teachers as I can that are actively in classrooms that want support to help them. I know, Sarah, and that's the thing that's annoying is like nobody's doing this. So I'm sitting there, I'm like, why would y'all not fund this? Like, that's silly.